On a freezing winter day, a compassionate waitress gave two hungry orphans a bowl of soup and lost her job because of it. 2 decades later, Eva Hartwell's calm routine is disrupted when a polished luxury Porsche pulls up outside her cafe. Stepping out are Diego and Sofia Valdez, the same children she once helped, now grown into adults with influence, success, and a gratitude she never imagined. What they disclose will restore her reputation, uncover the falsehoods that destroyed her,
and prove that a single act of kindness can change everything. Eva hadn't had a visitor in 10 years when that Christmas Eve rolled around in 2023. Not since the town called her a thief. Not since the church called her worse. The whispers followed her like shadows in those days. And I watched from this very window as neighbors crossed the street rather than walk past her little house on Maple Street. But on that particular Christmas Eve night, when that black Porsche purred up her broken driveway like a cat stalking prey, some debts don't stay buried forever. The two figures stepping out of that gleaming car carried the kind of reckoning that only comes when the hungry get fed and the liars get found. The headlights cut through the December darkness, illuminating her old soup kitchen sign,
hanging crooked on its rusty chain. Humble bowl. It had read once back when the letters weren't faded and the hope wasn't gone. The paint was peeling now, 20 years of weather having taken its toll. But somehow those words still held power, still meant something to folks who remembered. A man stepped out first, his movements careful and deliberate. Even from my window 3 houses down, I could see he was tall, well-dressed, the kind of man who'd learned to carry himself with purpose. His gloved hand clutched something small and stained. My old eyes weren't what they used to be, but I could tell it was a napkin, old and yellowed with age. A napkin from 2003, as it would turn out. But why did they wait 20 years to come back, and why Corinne Kincaid's name was scribbled on that napkin in what looked suspiciously like dried blood? Well, that's where our story truly begins. The woman who emerged from the passenger side moved with the grace of someone who'd fought battles and won them. Someone who'd learned that victory sometimes tastes like soup and sometimes like justice. Her hair caught the streetlight, and for a moment, I thought I was seeing a ghost. But ghosts don't drive Porsches, and ghosts don't carry briefcases full of legal documents that would topple an empire built on the suffering of children. You see, December 17, 2003, was the day Eva Hartwell lost her job and found her soul. I remember it clear as yesterday, because that was the morning my Iris Calloway made her last batch of Christmas cookies before the cancer took her voice away. The snow was falling thick that morning, the kind that makes the whole world look clean, even when it's rotten underneath. From my kitchen window, I watched the flakes dance in the amber glow of the streetlights, each one perfect and unique. Just like the souls we meet in this life. Eva had been working the morning shift at Hopper's Diner over on Commerce Street, pouring coffee for truckers and serving up eggs that had seen better days. It was honest work for honest pay, and Eva had never asked for more than that. She was the kind of woman who said please and thank you to everyone, who remembered how customers liked their coffee, who slipped extra bacon to the construction workers who reminded her of her daddy. Hopper's wasn't much to look at. Truth be told, the linoleum was cracked. The booths were held together with duct tape and prayer. And the coffee machine made sounds like a dying cat when it was brewing. But it was warm, and it smelled like home cooking. And for folks who didn't have much of either, it was a sanctuary. Eva understood that. She'd made it her mission to make sure everyone who walked through those doors felt like they belonged somewhere, even if it was just for the time it took to drink a cup of coffee. But then they walked in, and everything changed. Diego Valdez and Sofia Valdez, 7 and 9 years old, respectively, though their eyes looked decades older. They weren't beggars, mind you. Ghosts is what they were, with ribs like prison bars showing through. Their thin jackets and fingers were so pale they looked translucent. Their shoes had holes that let the snow seep through. And Sofia Valdez kept stomping her feet to keep the feeling in her toes, making little squeaking sounds on the worn linoleum. They stood by the door like they weren't sure they were allowed to come in, their eyes taking in the warmth and the smell of food with the kind of hunger that goes deeper than the stomach. Diego had his arm around his sister's shoulders, protective in the way that children learn to be when adults fail them. Sofia clutched a paper bag that looked like it held everything she owned in this world. When Eva saw them huddled by the door, something stirred in her chest, something she hadn't felt since she was their age. Standing in the kitchen of Sister Agatha's orphanage, watching the other children fight over scraps, she remembered the taste of watered-down gruel and the ache of going to bed with an empty stomach. She remembered Sister Agatha's ruler across her knuckles when she was caught stealing bread for the smaller children. The memories came flooding back like a dam bursting. Sister Agatha had been a woman who believed suffering built character, that hunger taught gratitude, that children were born sinful and needed to be purged of their wickedness through deprivation. Stealing bread gets you the closet, the old nun would say, her voice sharp as winter wind, her eyes cold as January frost, but sharing it gets you the strap. Eva could still feel the welts that strap had left, could still remember the taste of her own blood when she bit her tongue to keep from crying out. But what Sister Agatha never understood was that every blow of that strap only strengthened Eva's resolve to be different, to be better, to be the kind of person who saw hunger and filled it instead of using it as a weapon. Looking at these two children, Eva saw herself 30 years back, all hollow cheeks and desperate hope. Without a word, she moved to the soup pot and ladled out the biggest bowl the diner had, thick with vegetables and links of beef that cost more than her hourly wage. The soup was her own recipe, something she'd been perfecting for months, adding herbs and spices she bought with her own money to make it taste like love felt warm. She slid the bowl across the counter along with a basket of crackers and 2 glasses of milk that she'd pay for herself if she had to. The milk was fresh and cold, the kind of white that promised nutrition and comfort. She added a pat of butter to the crackers, knowing that sometimes it's the small luxuries that remind us we're human. Sophia's eyes went wide as saucers when she saw that feast spread before them. She grabbed a handful of crackers and stuffed them in her sock with the quick, furtive movements of someone who'd learned that food was never guaranteed. For later, she whispered, as if speaking too loud might make the bounty disappear like a mirage in the desert. Diego Valdez said nothing, just stared at that bowl like it was the Holy Grail itself. His hand shook as he picked up the spoon. And Eva could see the prayer of gratitude in his eyes, the kind of thanksgiving that comes from the very depths of the soul. When he took that first sip, his whole body relaxed for maybe the first time in months. Hank Donnelly, the dishwasher who'd been working at Hopper's since before televisions were in color, shuffled over and watched the children eat. He was a man of few words, carved from granite and weathered by time. But when he did speak, folks listened. His hands were scarred from years of washing dishes in scalding water, and his back was bent from decades of standing over industrial sinks. But his eyes were sharp and kind. "Kid," he said to Eva, his voice rough as sandpaper dragged across concrete, "you just fed 2 wolves. The problem is one's named Corinne." Now, Corinne Kincaid was the kind of woman who wore her cruelty like jewelry, all shiny and displayed for the world to see. She managed the day shift at Hopper's with an iron fist wrapped in a silk glove. And she had eyes like a hawk and twice the mean streak. She'd been watching Eva and those children from across the diner, her red lipstick pursed in disapproval that could freeze coffee in the cup. Corinne believed in rules the way some people believe in religion, with zealous fervor and no room for interpretation. There was a rule about not serving people who couldn't pay, a rule about portion control, a rule about everything that might interfere with the profit margin. She kept those rules written down in a little notebook she carried, adding new ones. Whenever she caught someone showing too much humanity. Her office was in the back of the diner, a cramped space that smelled of cigarettes and cheap perfume. The walls were covered with employee schedules, health department certificates, and photographs of Corinne with various local dignitaries. She kept a calculator on her desk at all times, constantly running numbers, always looking for ways to squeeze more profit from less investment. But Eva had learned something important in those orphanage years, something that Corinne would never understand. Kindness ain't free. It's a debt the world collects with interest, and the interest rate varies depending on how much love you put into the principal. And sure enough, as those children finished their soup and wiped their hands on the empty bowl, Corinne's scream cut through the diner like a knife through silk. "Where's the cash?" The tip jar was gone. $2,347 that Eva had been saving for her mother's Christmas present had vanished like smoke in the wind. It wasn't much money, not to most folks, but to Eva, it represented hours of refilled coffee cups and patient smiles. Small kindnesses that added up to something meaningful. Corinne's painted nails left moon-shaped cuts on Ava's arm as she grabbed her. Her French manicure drew blood from skin that had already been weathered by years of honest work. "I saw you with those little thieves," Corinne hissed. Her breath smelled of coffee and spite and something rotten underneath. "You're all in it together, aren't you? Running some kind of scam on my diner." The accusation hit Eva like a physical blow. In all her years of working, in all her years of serving others, no one had ever questioned her honesty. Her integrity was the one thing she'd managed to keep intact through all the hardships of her life. The one treasure that couldn't be stolen or lost or broken. The police came within the hour, their boots heavy on the cracked linoleum, their questions sharp and suspicious. Officer Delian was kind enough, but Officer Klein had the look of a man who'd already made up his mind before he walked through the door. They took statements from Corinne, from Hank Donnelly, from the 3 customers who'd been in the diner when the jar disappeared. The children were long gone by then, vanished into the December cold like they'd never existed at all. But the empty bowl remained on the counter, a testament to the meal that had started this whole chain of events. Eva stared at that bowl while the officers questioned her, wondering if she'd somehow brought this on herself by daring to show compassion. The manager came next, Mr. Harrington, a thin man who looked like he'd been pressed flat by the weight of corporate expectations. He'd been running Hoppers for 15 years, and in all that time, he'd never had an employee accused of theft. His hands shook as he filled out the paperwork, as if the very act of firing someone might contaminate him with their supposed dishonesty. By evening, there was a pink slip in Ava's locker, and a notice that read "Terminated for theft" in Corinne's careful handwriting. But the real crime wasn't the missing money, though that stung deep enough. The real crime was that napkin, the one Eva had used to wipe Sophia's chin when the child had dripped soup on her jacket. Later, much later, Eva would remember the details that didn't make sense at the time. The way Corinne had lingered by the children's table after they'd left. The way she'd picked up that napkin and examined it closely before stuffing it in her apron pocket. The way she'd smiled when she thought no one was looking. A smile born not of joy, but of pure satisfaction. The napkin carried Corinne's lipstick print. Of course it did, but it held something more: numerals scratched in what looked like Diego's unsteady, childlike script. Digits that, when placed in proper order, became the combination to the diner's safe numbers no patron should ever know. Numbers Corinne herself had scribbled and left carelessly on the counter that morning while hurrying to make the bank deposit. Hopper's security cameras were ancient and fickle. And wouldn't you know it, the footage from 3:07 p.m. was mysteriously corrupted. Technical malfunction, the company told police when they asked to review the tape. Happens all the time with old systems. Hank Donnelly knew better though. As Eva emptied her locker that night, hands trembling with equal parts fury and heartache, He hobbled over with his familiar limp and whispered words that would echo in her head for years. "Jess's brother runs the shelter those kids vanished from," he murmured, eyes flicking toward the kitchen where Corinne was tallying the day's take with unusual thoroughness. "Funny how kids keep disappearing there and Jess keeps getting bonuses for efficiency." Pieces of a wider puzzle lay scattered around them, but Ava was too raw and blindsided to fit them together. Yet all she could feel was the sheer unfairness of it. How 2 decades of honest work could be wiped away by one moment of compassion gone wrong. That night, trudging home through snow that had shifted from pretty to perilous, she caught a final glimpse of Diego Valdez and Sofia as they were lifted into a Child Protective Services van, their small bodies dwarfed by the official-looking adults around them. Sofia wept, her tears freezing on her cheeks in the bitter air, but Diego didn't cry. He stared straight at Eva through the back window, his young face set with a resolve far older than his 7 years. His lips shaped 2 words she would never forget. 2 words that would ring in her mind for the next 20 years. "Will return." The van vanished into the dark, taking them back to whatever hell they'd fled, and Eva stood in the falling snow, wondering whether she had just witnessed her own undoing or theirs. Morning brought a blow that turned her blood to ice and broke her heart all over again. Humble Bowl, the tiny soup kitchen she had been planning to open with her life savings, was condemned by the city. The building she'd put a deposit on, the place she meant to serve anyone in need, was suddenly deemed structurally unsound, according to an inspector's report that seemed to appear overnight like mushrooms after rain. The report was signed by Inspector Graham Keller, who just happened to be married to Corinne's cousin. The condemnation order bore a co-signature from Deputy Mayor Conrad Howell, who just happened to be Corinne's new boyfriend and soon to be her husband at a wedding society pages would call the season's crown jewel. Funny how love and politics make convenient companions, how money and power swirl together like cream into coffee. Ava's deposit, every cent she'd saved through 5 years of double shifts and skipped meals, was forfeit under the lease's fine print. No refunds for acts of God or municipal actions. Standing before that condemned shell on the morning of December 19, 2003, Ava felt something inside her chest go quiet. Not her kindness, not her drive to help, but her faith in the system meant to protect people like her, the ones supposedly built to reward hard work and punish those who prey on the vulnerable. The wrecking ball arrived that same afternoon, as if the city couldn't wait to scrub away every trace of her dream. She stood with the onlookers, watching 2 decades of planning crumble to dust and broken brick. The clamor of destruction was deafening. Yet, she could still hear the memory of her own voice, explaining to the bank officer how she would serve free meals to anyone who came through those doors. When the dust finally settled and trucks began hauling off debris, Eva noticed 2 familiar faces in the crowd. They weren't crying like the neighbors who knew her plans. They weren't sad or sympathetic. They were counting their miles moved with each falling chunk, each collapsing wall. Only later would she grasp that Diego Valdez and Sofia were storing away every detail of that ruin, filing it beside each injustice they'd seen, every cruelty endured. Even at 7 and 9, they were building the case, gathering evidence for a reckoning still 20 years away. With no job, no prospects, and no references, no hope in a town that had decided she was a thief, Ava's soup kitchen dream shrank into something humbler and more urgent. A shopping cart borrowed from the grocery lot, a thrift store hot plate, a wobbly card table sturdy enough to hold hope. She set it beneath the Morrison Street Bridge, where homeless veterans gathered, and the city's forgotten found cover from the weather and from respectable eyes. Concrete walls there were layered with graffiti, telling stories of love and loss, of delayed dreams and broken promises. Yet beauty lived there, 2 murals from artists who knew the truest art often rises from the darkest places. The veterans became her guardians, Men and women who'd seen too much war and too little peace. People who understood what it meant to be discarded by a society that once called them heroes. C.T. Raphael. The Mingjus had lost his left leg in desert. Storm and his family to the long road home. Helen Rourke served 3 tours in Vietnam as an army nurse and returned to a country that spat on her uniform. "You fed my kid, lady," Marco Vega told her one cold January evening, eyes gentle despite the scars that traced half his face. Nico Alvarez was one of those kids you slipped extra pancakes to on Sundays. "Now we feed you." They formed a protective circle around her makeshift kitchen. These broken soldiers who'd learned the hardest fights aren't waged with weapons, but with compassion. They hauled water, shared cans from their own scant supplies, and stood watch while she cooked, making sure no one hassled the woman who fed others when she could barely feed herself. In the dented recipe box she carried, wrapped in plastic against the rain, Eva kept more than recipes. Every napkin with a thank you. Every scrap where someone wrote a name to prove they existed. Each small token of gratitude from those she'd fed. The box became a ledger of dignity, proof that kindness given returns as kindness. There were letters from truckers who remembered her coffee, from students who scraped up change for a finals week meal, from single mothers who brought their children to Hoppers because it was the only place they could afford a night out. Every slip told a story, and each story mattered. At the bottom, wrapped like a relic, lay a photograph she'd found skittering in the wind after the wrecking ball struck. Someone had dropped it or tossed it, assuming nobody would notice. Eva noticed. What she saw froze her veins. The image showed Corinne passing a thick envelope to Marcus Lowell, the CPS director, both smiling like they just sealed a lucrative deal. They stood outside Cedar Ridge Group Home, the place records said had housed Diego and Sofia before they wandered into Hoppers. That December morning. The timestamp read December 20th, 2003, one day after Diego and Sofia were swept back into the system. One day after Eva lost everything. One day after Corinne Kincaid got precisely what she wanted. For 10 long years, Eva ladled soup from that shopping cart under the bridge. She served construction workers between jobs, college kids whose aid had run out, young adults who had aged out of foster care with nowhere to land. She fed retired teachers whose pensions had been looted, disabled veterans waiting on benefits that might never arrive, immigrant families whose American dream had collided with poverty. Each bowl came with a story, and each story settled into Ava's bones like silt in a river. She came to see she wasn't just feeding bodies. She was feeding souls, nourishing the part of humanity society had ignored or abandoned. But on nights when the bridge fell quiet, except for traffic humming overhead and wind whistling through steel girders, doubt crept in. Was she saving souls? Or drowning her shame in an endless sea of hunger no one person could fill? It was worst when police told them to move along, when officials seized her car for health code violations, and when well-meaning neighbors complained about the eyesore of desperate people in their tidy district. Some nights on her shelter cot, she wondered if Corinne had been right, as she was enabling folks who should be helping themselves. Then morning came, and someone approached with hollow eyes and empty hands. And Eva remembered why she started. Soup isn't only food, she'd learned. It's proof. Proof someone saw you when the world looked away. Proof you mattered when everything else said you didn't. Proof love can be measured by the tablespoon and served hot when the rest of life is gone. Cold. Years slipped by like seasons, new faces, familiar hungers. Ava's hair silvered then whitened. Her hands ached from stirring and ladling. Her back bent from hauling water and folding tables. Her feet flattened from hours on concrete, but her smile held. Her ladle stayed busy, and her faith in basic goodness somehow outlived every cruelty the world hurled at her. Then came the fire that changed everything. It was a Tuesday in March 2013, almost 10 years to the day since she'd lost her job at Hoppers. Ava had just finished serving about 40 people when Eddie Carver, a veteran haunted by addiction and demons with names but no cures, drifted near the propane tank with a lit cigarette dangling from his lips. The blast wasn't huge, but it was quick and ravenous. Flames raced through her setup like a living thing, devouring months of careful order in minutes. The cot, the hot plate, the wobbling table that had become her altar of service, all of it collapsed into ash and twisted metal before firefighters arrived. The cruelest loss was the recipe box with its fragile treasury of dignity. 20 years of thank yous and napkin notes, 2 decades proving her work mattered. A lifetime of evidence that kindness given returns in kind, gone as smoke. Carry her life's work into the gray March sky. Eddie was badly burned, suffering second-degree injuries on his arms and face. And as the ambulance doors closed, he kept apologizing through blistered lips. "I'm sorry, Miss Eva. I'm so sorry. I didn't mean it." Even then, watching everything turn to ash, Ava clasped his hand and said, "It's okay, honey. Things can be replaced." "You can't." The fire investigator, a compassionate woman named Captain Fiona Doyle, found Eva perched on a slab of broken concrete, gazing at what was left with dry eyes and a heavy chest. "I'm sorry for your loss," she said and meant it. She'd seen enough blazes to know the difference between losing possessions and losing purpose. But not everything burned. In the deepest corner of that metal box, shielded by layers of plastic and Ava's foresight, one item survived. A business card, edges singed, print still legible. Kincaid Holdings, creating solutions for tomorrow's challenges. Cream-colored stock. Expensive, the kind that whispers power. On the back, in a hand Eva didn't recognize, were the faded words, "Cedar Ridge, monthly payments, keep quiet." The words made her pulse quicken with the first real hope in years. Cedar Ridge, the group. Home where Diego and Sofia had disappeared 2 decades earlier. Monthly payments that could mean only one thing. Someone was being paid to stay silent about what went on there. And the card belonged to Corinne Kincaid's company, the empire built on the ashes of other people's dreams. That card became Ava's compass, her reason to rise each morning and figure out how to rebuild what the fire stole. She spent long nights at the public library, scrolling through records until her eyes burned. Miss Yoon, the librarian and elder who remembered when libraries were sanctuaries, brought coffee and gentle reminders to rest. "You're hunting for something specific," she observed one evening as Eva rubbed her temples. It wasn't a question. "Justice," Eva answered. "I'm looking for justice." What she found in the numbers made her stomach turn in a way hunger never had. Kincaid Holdings' tax returns for the past decade told a story both intricate and brutally simple. Buried in schedules and agendas, hidden behind corporate jargon and accounting fog, lay proof of a system designed to profit from human misery. Dining Solutions, $12,000 per month from Cedar Ridge Group Home. Read line 47 of the 2012 return. The same amount appeared annually, always from the same source, always labeled consulting fees for nutritional program management. Cedar Ridge, the place where Diego and Sofia's paperwork had gone missing. The facility had a suspicious number of runaways who were never reported missing. It was an institution receiving state funds to house and feed children who, on paper, didn't exist. The deeper she dug, the uglier it became. Cedar Ridge, a temporary placement center, kept kids an average of over 3 years. The state paid $400 per child per day for housing, school, medical care, and food. But the children weren't being educated. They were working in industrial kitchens, preparing meals for other state facilities. They weren't getting real medical care. A nurse practitioner with a history of falsified records handled them. And they certainly weren't being fed properly. Nutrition budgets were siphoned off for consulting, which seemed to have meant teaching hungry kids to prepare food they couldn't eat. The paper trail ran through shell companies and dummies, And at the center sat Corinne Kincaid, her empire shielded by officials too corrupted to care or too clueless to notice. Here's where the tale turns in ways no one, least of all me, expected. Diego and Sofia hadn't just survived the hell Corinne and her brother engineered. They rose in ways that would make even the most hopeful caseworker cry. Diego built a company called Nourish from little more than a phone app and the resolve to make sure no child went hungry as he had. By 2020, Nourish delivered free meals into food desserts, partnering with restaurants to redirect surplus to families in need. The company outgrew Kincaid Holdings' wildest dreams, and every dollar of profit fed new programs. Sofia fought in courtrooms instead of kitchens. She took the cases no one wanted. Children failed by the system, families crushed by bureaucracy, voices smothered by power. Her firm, Hartwell and Associates, was named after a diner worker who showed her grace when the world showed only contempt. She earned a reputation for winning the unwinnable through grit and an intimate understanding of institutional failure. For 20 years, they watched Corinne gathering evidence like spiders spinning a web. Every contract, every falsified report, every child who vanished into her machinery and emerged broken was documented, cataloged, and readied for the day justice would knock. They'd learned that justice delayed isn't always justice denied. Sometimes it's justice perfected, aged until potent enough to topple empires built on suffering. They learned to think in decades, plotting moves like chess players 20 turns ahead. The Porsche that rolled up to Ava's house that Christmas Eve wasn't originally theirs. It had belonged to Corinne Kincaid, with funds meant to feed hungry children. Driven to charity galas where she accepted awards for helping at-risk youth. Now the signed title sat in the glove box along with the deed to a downtown building worth more than all the soup kitchens in the world. But money wasn't why they came. Money was just a tool, a means to an end 20 years in the making. They came to deliver something rarer, vindication, justice, and the quiet sweetness of watching Corinne Kincaid finally face consequences for 2 decades of cruelty dressed up as charity. Sofia stepped from the Porsche, looking every bit the leader she'd become, steady and self-possessed. But when she saw Ava through the window, her poise cracked just a little. For a heartbeat, she was 9 again, clutching a paper bag that held her whole life, wordlessly grateful for a bowl of soup and the kindness of a stranger who chose to see her humanity when others saw a problem to manage. Diego moved like a man careful with power, someone who knew real strength comes from service, not control. In his hand was the napkin that had sealed it all 20 years before. Sealed in plastic, it was evidence that was always ready to speak for itself. When the story broke in January 2024, the press dubbed it the soup kitchen scandal. Those who had watched knew it was far more a reckoning 2 decades in the making. Proof that the arc of the moral universe may bend toward justice, but sometimes needs a firm hand to help it along. Corinne Kincaid stood on the courthouse steps in a designer suit and pearls, declaring innocence to every camera and mic. She spoke of disgruntled ex-employees and ungrateful charity cases, of a conspiracy by people who didn't grasp the complexities of social services. Her lawyer, a very expensive man in a very expensive suit, invoked the presumption of innocence and the perils of trial by media. But words are air until evidence gives them weight, and the record Sofia and Diego assembled over 2 decades was sweeping and damning. Financials showed money for children's meals diverted into personal accounts. Medical files exposed systematic neglect and abuse. Employment records put kids as young as 8 to work in commercial kitchens without pay. The recording Noel Ingram played for the packed courtroom was 20 years old, but restoration tech, developed by Diego's company, made every syllable crisp. Corinne's younger voice, just as frigid, spelled out a plan to use group home children as unpaid labor while billing the state for full care. "Those kids are worth more working than eating," she said with critical cool. Let them think that soup kitchen woman stole their money. It keeps them grateful and keeps them quiet. If any get too mouthy, we can always make them disappear somewhere else in the system. Who's going to miss a couple of throwaway kids? What followed was a community uprising, conscience on its feet. Homeless families flooded city council chambers with signs bearing Ava's face and testimonials about meals served. Beneath the bridge, former group home residents, now adults, told stories that made hardened reporters cry. She fed us, they chanted, voices bouncing off marble and back at the officials whose blindness and graft had sheltered Corinne's abuse. She fed us when no one else would. She saw us when no one else cared. Faced with overwhelming proof of his administration's complicity in 20 years of systemic child abuse, the mayor called an emergency press conference and announced his immediate resignation. The deputy mayor, Corinne's husband, was arrested before he could follow suit. The city council voted unanimously to void every contract Kincaid Holdings had ever received, and the state attorney general announced a criminal investigation that would eventually reach into dozens of similar facilities across the region. But Diego's testimony was the bomb that leveled Corinne's empire entirely. The killing blow was delivered with the precision of someone who'd been planning it for 20 years. His forensic accounting, backed up by teams of investigators and data analysts, proved that Kincaid Holdings had embezzled $2.8 million from school lunch programs over the past decade. Money meant to feed children was redirected to Corinne's personal accounts, vacation homes, and luxury cars. The numbers were staggering, but it was the human cost that truly broke hearts in that courtroom. Diego Valdez spoke in a voice that remained steady despite the tears streaming down his face, describing how he and his sister had been forced to work 16-hour days in commercial kitchens, preparing thousands of meals for school districts while being fed nothing but thin gruel and stale bread. "We made food for other children while we starved," he said, his words carrying the weight of years of accumulated pain. "We prepared birthday cakes for school celebrations while we forgot what cake tasted like. We packaged lunches for field trips we would never take to places we would never see, for childhoods we would never have." Sophia's testimony was equally devastating, but delivered with the critical precision of someone who'd learned to weaponize her pain in service of justice. She detailed the systematic abuse that went beyond mere hunger, describing how children who complained or asked questions were punished with solitary confinement, how medical care was withheld as a form of control, and how education was replaced with labor that generated profit for Corinne's empire. "They didn't just steal our food," Sophia said, her voice cutting through the silence of the packed courtroom like a blade through cloth. "They stole our childhoods, our health, our futures. They turned us into commodities, bought and sold, and traded like livestock. And when we dared to dream of something better, when we dared to believe we deserve more than scraps and cruelty, they made sure we knew our place." The climax came on the third day of testimony, when Corinne, finally realizing that her carefully constructed world was crumbling around her like a house built on sand, lunged across the courtroom at Eva in a final act of desperate rage. She moved like a woman possessed, her face twisted with 20 years of accumulated hatred for the person who'd shown kindness when Corinne had demanded only submission. But Eva, weathered by 20 years of serving soup to desperate people, strengthened by decades of choosing love over fear, caught Corinne's wrist with hands that remained steady despite everything she'd endured. The courtroom held its breath as these two women faced each other across 20 years of pain and injustice. Predator and prey switching roles in a moment that felt like cosmic justice finally asserting itself. "You starved them," Eva said, her voice calm as still water, carrying the weight of absolute moral authority. "You took children who had nothing, and you gave them less than nothing. You turned their hunger into your profit and their pain into your pleasure. I saved you the trouble of having a conscience." The judge, a stern woman who'd seen too many cases of institutional abuse, but never one quite this systematic, sentenced Corinne to 15 years in federal prison and ordered full restitution to every child who'd been harmed by her operation. Amount was staggering, over $40 million when accounting for lost wages, medical costs, psychological damage, and punitive damages. But money, as important as it was, couldn't undo 20 years of trauma. What mattered more was the symbolic victory, the knowledge that someone had finally been held accountable for treating children like commodities instead of human beings. What mattered was the message sent to every other Corinne Kincaid operating in the shadows that their time of reckoning would come. The mayor, faced with his own corruption charges and overwhelming evidence of his administration's complicity, held one final press conference before disappearing into federal protection and a plea deal that would keep him out of prison in exchange for his cooperation. At that conference, with shaking hands and a voice that cracked with something that might have been genuine remorse, he tore up every eviction notice his office had ever served against Ava's various soup kitchens. Diego, tears streaming down his face as he watched 20 years of planning finally come to fruition, handed Eva a key. Not to the Porsche, though that was part of the package. Not to money, though there was plenty of that too. The key was to something far more valuable, something that represented the completion of a circle that had begun with a bowl of soup on a snowy December morning. The new humble bowl opened 6 months later in the heart of downtown, a gleaming facility that looked like a restaurant, but operated like a mission. The building had been Corinne's headquarters, the place where she'd planned her empire of exploitation. But now it hummed with the sound of industrial mixers preparing soup for anyone who needed it. The kitchen was state-of-the-art, capable of serving 500 meals a day, but it was designed with dignity in mind. The dining room looked like a real restaurant with tablecloths and flowers and music playing softly in the background. There were no lines, no numbers, no degrading processes, designed to make people feel ashamed of their hunger. There were just tables and chairs and servers who understood that food is love made visible. The gold plaque by the door read simply, "No one leaves hungry." But underneath, in smaller letters that most people missed unless they were looking for it, were the words that really mattered. In memory of every child who went to bed hungry, and in hope that no child ever will again. Even Corinne, working off her community service in the kitchen while serving the first year of her sentence under a work release program, learned something about the dignity of honest labor and the satisfaction of feeding others instead of feeding off them. She worked in silence, mostly, her designer clothes replaced by a simple apron, her manicured nails broken from honest work. At first, she did the work with resentful compliance, going through the motions without understanding the mission. But gradually something began to change. Maybe it was seeing the gratitude in people's eyes when they received a meal. Maybe it was finally understanding what it meant to give instead of take. Or maybe it was simply the way 20 years of accumulated guilt finally found a constructive outlet. One evening, as they were closing up the kitchen, Corinne approached Eva with something that might have been an apology, struggling to escape from lips that had never learned how to form such words. "I don't know how to say sorry for 20 years, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Eva looked at her for a long moment. This woman who had caused so much pain, who had turned cruelty into a business model and suffering into profit. Then, she handed Corinne a ladle and said simply, "Start with tomorrow's soup." Sophia adopted a little girl from Cedar Ridge Group Home during the facility's closure. A child with hollow eyes and 2 thin arms who reminded everyone of 2 orphans who'd walked into a diner 20 years before. The girl had been in the system for 3 years, passed from home to home, failed by every institution meant to protect her. "Her name's Ava," Sophia announced at the grand opening celebration, the little girl clinging to her hand like a lifeline while taking in the warmth and abundance of the new, humble bowl with eyes that couldn't quite believe what they were. seeing. And she's going to grow up knowing that the world has people in it who will feed her when she's hungry and hold her when she's scared. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone present. Here was the cycle completing itself. Trauma transformed into healing. Pain converted into purpose. The little girl would grow up in a world where Corinne Kincaid's empire of exploitation had been replaced by Eva Hartwell's legacy of compassion, where the very building that had once housed meetings about maximizing profit from human misery now served free meals to anyone who needed them. Hank Donnelly, now 94 and still sharp as the day is long, despite his bent back and slow shuffle, came to the grand opening ceremony, leaning heavily on a walker but refusing all offers to sit down. He'd outlived Hopper's Diner, outlived the three owners, and outlived his own expectations of how long a dishwasher could keep going on stubbornness and spite. He shuffled up to Ava during the ceremony, his eyes still bright despite the clouded cataracts, and delivered his verdict on 20 years of struggle and redemption. "Kid," he said, his voice still rough as sandpaper dragged across concrete, "you fed the wolves, and they remembered. Funny how that works when you give instead of take." But perhaps the most beautiful moment came on a snowy December evening. Exactly 20 years after their first bowl of soup that started this whole chain of events, Ava was closing up the kitchen when she heard humming from the dining room. A sound so pure and sweet it seemed to make the very air shimmer with joy. There, though, sat Sophia, now a successful lawyer and mother, humming "You Are My Sunshine" while her daughter colored at one of the tables. The little girl was using bright yellow crayons to draw what looked like a bowl of soup with steam rising from it in spirals that turned into musical notes. "My grandmother used to sing that to me at the first orphanage," Sophia said when she saw Eva watching from the kitchen doorway. "Before the hunger got so bad, we forgot how to sing. Before we learned that music was a luxury we couldn't afford, you gave that back to us. You know, the ability to remember joy, the permission to hope for better things." Ava's eyes filled with tears she'd been holding back for 2 decades. Salt water that tasted like vindication, sorrow, and gratitude all mixed together. All those years of doubt. All those nights wondering if she'd done the right thing. If one bowl of soup could really matter in a world so full of cruelty and indifference. Here was her answer, humming softly in the warm light of a kitchen filled with hope instead of hunger. The old recipe box was gone, burned in that fire all those years ago. But Eva had learned that the most important recipes aren't written down. Anyway, they're passed from heart to heart, from one hungry soul to another, in the simple act of seeing someone's need and choosing to fill it. They're measured not in cups and teaspoons, but in compassion and courage, seasoned with justice and served with the understanding that we're all just temporary stewards of whatever abundance we're blessed to receive. Feed one mouth, you save a body. Feed a soul, you save generations. As I finish this tale, sitting in my chair by the window where I've watched the world change for nearly a century, I can see the humble bowl from here. The lights are always on, the door never locked, steam rising from the kitchen like prayers ascending to heaven. The building glows with warmth in the December darkness, a beacon for anyone who needs to remember that kindness still exists in a world that sometimes seems to have forgotten how to care. Sometimes late at night, when the snow is falling and the world is quiet except for the whisper of wind through bare branches, I see a black Porsche pull up. 2 figures get out. No longer the hollowed children they once were, but successful. Adults who never forgot where they came from or who helped them survive their darkest hours. They roll up their sleeves and help serve soup to whoever needs it, their faces reflecting the same kindness that Eva showed them all those years ago. Diego, now in his late 20s, moves through the kitchen with the efficiency of someone who learned early how precious food can be. He's expanded Nourish to serve meals in 12 cities, partnering with formerly homeless individuals to run the local operations, creating jobs for people who understand hunger from the inside out. His company doesn't just deliver food, it delivers dignity, respect, and the revolutionary idea that everyone deserves to eat well, regardless of their ability to pay. Sophia works with local lawmakers to reform the child welfare system, using her legal expertise and personal experience to craft legislation that prioritizes children's well-being over institutional convenience. She's helped pass laws requiring more stringent oversight of group homes, better funding for nutrition programs, and harsher penalties for anyone who profits from child abuse. Together, they've created a foundation that bears Ava's name, providing grants to soup kitchens and food pantries across the country. But more than money, they provide something that can't be quantified: hope. Hope that systems can change, that justice can prevail, that kindness planted in darkness can grow into something beautiful and transformative. The Porsche itself has become something of a legend. Then Diego Valdez had it repainted from black to sunny yellow, and Sophia had the words "free meals" inside, printed on the doors in letters that can't be missed. It's not just transportation anymore. It's a mobile advertisement for the power of redemption, a rolling reminder that even the vehicles of the corrupt can be transformed into tools of healing. And sometimes, if you listen close when the wind is just right and the night is very still, you can hear something floating on the air from that kitchen. Not just the clatter of ladles and the bubble of simmering broth, but something else. Something that sounds suspiciously like hope, like healing, like the echo of a 9-year-old girl's voice humming, "You are my sunshine," while she colors pictures of soup bowls and dreams of a world where no child goes hungry. The veterans under the Morrison Street Bridge still gather. Sometimes, though most of them have found housing through programs that Sophia helped establish. They come to the humble bowl because they need the meals, but also because they remember when Eva served them from a shopping cart with more heart than resources. They come to pay their respects to a woman who understood that dignity matters as much as nutrition. Seeing someone's humanity is just as important as feeding their body. To Rafael Dominguez, his prosthetic leg, now state-of-the-art thanks to veterans' benefits that Alyssa Shaw helped to navigate, works part-time at the Humble Bowl as a security guard. Not because the place needs protection, but because he wants to protect the woman who protected him when he had nothing left but hunger and pride, too stubborn to ask for help. Helen Rock, the Vietnam veteran nurse, runs the Humble Bowl's medical clinic, providing basic health care to anyone who walks through the doors. She's seen too much suffering to turn anyone away, and she understands that hunger and illness are often partners in the dance of poverty. Her clinic operates on the same principle as Ava's kitchen. No questions asked, no judgment passed, just help given to whoever needs it. The anniversary of their first bowl of soup has become an unofficial holiday in the neighborhood. A day when the community comes together to remember that individual acts of kindness can echo through decades. The celebration isn't grand or elaborate. It's just a shared meal where everyone sits at the same table, where the served become the servers, where former enemies break bread together in a ritual of reconciliation that would have been unimaginable 20 years ago. Corinne, now 3 years into her sentence and genuinely transformed by the experience of serving others, wrote a letter that Eva keeps framed on her office wall. It's not an eloquent document. Corinne was never much with words when they weren't being used as weapons, but it's sincere in a way that cuts through all the legal language and courtroom drama to touch something essential about human nature's capacity for change. I spent 20 years building an empire on other people's hunger. The letter reads in Corinne's careful handwriting. I convinced myself I was helping, that I was providing structure and discipline to children who needed guidance, but I was really just feeding my own hunger for power and control. You showed me the difference between taking and giving, between using people and serving them. I can't undo 20 years of damage, but I can try to spend the rest of my life balancing the scales. The letter goes on to detail Corinne's plans for when she's released. Her intention to use her business skills to support organizations like the Humble Bowl. Her commitment to making amends, not just through restitution, but through service. It's signed simply, Corinne Kincaid, as if she's finally learning to take responsibility for both parts of her identity, instead of hiding behind titles and married names. So next time you pass a soup kitchen or see someone hungry on the street, or encounter a small act of kindness that seems insignificant in the grand scheme of things, remember Eva Hartwell and two orphan children who learned that love can be ladled from a bowl and served with crackers on the side. Listen close. You might just hear your name in the steam, calling you to remember that in a world full of Corinne Kincaids, we all have the choice to be Eva Hartwell instead. The choice to see hunger and fill it, to see loneliness and warm it, to see despair, and offer it a seat at the table where everyone is welcome, and no one leaves empty. Because that's the thing about soup kitchens, you see, they're not really about the soup at all. They're about the kitchen part, the place where strangers become family, where a broken get mended one meal at a time, and where ordinary people discover they have the power to change the world one bowl at a time. That torn apron Eva wore during those bridge years now hangs framed in the new Humble Bowl kitchen, a reminder that sometimes the most important uniform is the one stained with service to others. Every morning when the staff arrives to begin preparing the day's meals, they touch their frame for luck, carrying forward the legacy of a woman who proved that the smallest acts of kindness can echo through decades, can transform lives, can literally move mountains of indifference and create valleys of compassion where none existed before. The recipe for that first bowl of soup, the one that started this whole chain of events, has been recreated and perfected by the Humble Bowls. Chef Jonah Mercer, a former Food Network star who gave up his television career to serve meals to people who couldn't pay for them. It's called Ava's Special, and it's made with ingredients that can't be measured. A cup of compassion, a tablespoon of hope, a generous portion of human dignity, and love enough to feed anyone who's hungry. Every bowl served carries that same energy, that same intention, that same refusal to accept that anyone should go hungry in a world of abundance. The steam that rises from those bowls carries more than just the aroma of vegetables and broth. It carries the promise that someone cares, that someone sees you, that someone believes you deserve to be fed regardless of your circumstances or your ability to reciprocate. The Humble Bowl now has 7 locations across 3 states, each one staffed partially by people who were once served there. People who understand hunger from the inside and refuse to let others experience what they experienced. The model has been replicated by other organizations, creating a network of compassion that stretches across the country like a web of hope. But it all started with one woman who saw 2 hungry children and decided that rules mattered less than hunger, that profit mattered less than people, that her own comfort mattered less than someone else's desperate need. It started with a choice that seemed small at the time, but rippled outward like circles on a pond, touching lives in ways she could never have imagined. And as I sit here in my chair, watching the snowfall outside my window on another December evening, I can see those circles still rippling outward. I can see the Humble Bowl's warm lights cutting through the darkness, promising warmth and sustenance to anyone who needs it. I can see the yellow Porsche parked outside, its cheerful color a deliberate rejection of the darkness it once represented. Most importantly, I can see hope. Hope that systems can change, that justice can prevail, that individual acts of kindness matter in ways we may never fully understand. Hope that in a world that sometimes seems designed to crush the vulnerable, there will always be people like Eva Hartwell who choose compassion over convenience, service over self-interest, love over fear. The steam still rises from that kitchen every night, carrying with it the prayers of the fed and the hopes of the hungry. And somewhere in that steam, if you listen with your heart instead of your ears, you can hear the voice of every soul who was touched by kindness when they needed it most. You can hear them saying thank you. You can hear them saying they remember. You can hear them promising to pass it on. And in a world that too often forgets the power of simple human decency, that promise echoes louder than any symphony, more beautiful than any song, as enduring as the love that first filled a bowl with soup and changed the world one spoonful at a time.